depends if they can stitch up any agreement with a new government. If that's a Sunni government led by Gilani or the influence of Gilani, whose objective, as I said earlier, was to get rid of Russia as the new enemy, then I don't see them having their bases in the future. So the key things are their airbase in Latakia province, and of course their Tartus naval base. Now the Tartus naval base enabled them to project power into the Mediterranean. Now that well-known liar Lavrov has said all the ships have just gone on exercise at the moment. We don't know if that's true. I suspect it's more than that, and there will be some form of evacuation in the near future.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the very dramatic events that have unfolded over recent days in Syria, and I'm delighted to be joined by Major General Chapman, a former British military advisor to US Central Command, who served for 33 years in the armed forces. He's also a respected commentator on geopolitics and security, and is the author of the book Notes from a Small Military. General Chapman, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good afternoon, James.
To begin with, I wonder to what extent you have been taken aback by the speed with which events in Syria have unfolded. Did you really think the Assad regime could fall so quickly?
Yeah, I did. And one of the reasons for that comes back to something that the head of MI6 said in September when he had a conversation with Bill Burns, the head of the CIA. It wasn't actually about Syria, but it was about Russia. But the same thing pertains. That is, don't ever mistake a tight grip for a stable grip. And if Assad was to lose the sponsorship of his backers quickly, and that was partly because of Israeli actions over the last year, then he had not a lot to fall back on. And the Alawite unity has gone. The Alawite control of the political military apparatus has gone. And once you start withdrawing, basically people down tools and no fighting takes place. That's a truism from Wavell in the Second World War. So having sort of identified that, I did think that they would fall quite quickly. That's the good news. Assad was a terrible authoritarian leader, and in the 54 years of his father and his brutal and repressive and oppressive regime, lots and lots of people died. That doesn't mean there are not going to be potentially problems in the day after. What I've just said also can, of course, still pertain to Russia in the future. Authoritarian regimes always seem secure right up to the moment that they're not.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and we'll come on to the impact on Russia, but also Iran in due course. Just focusing on the situation in Syria at the moment, break down, if you can, for us, Chip, who is fighting who? Because we've got lots of different groups here that we're talking about, notably Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is kind of the main rebel group that's now captured Damascus, but there are others as well. So who is fighting who, and who are they allied with?
Well, let's go back to the first start point of why this is really, really difficult. I always remember John Brennan, the head of the CIA, saying in 2016 that this was the most complicated and complex issue that he'd ever seen, with so many internal actors, so many external actors, all with different goals and objectives, and they're frequently in tension with each other. So firstly, let's look at the internal actors and how that sort of plays in with the external actors. So the main four you're really talking about here is firstly Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Now, a lot of people have mistaken Hayat Tahrir al-Sham because they've taken a linear progression of a number of things in terms of their history. Yes, they were an al-Qaeda faction, or broke from al-Qaeda initially. Yes, they were the al-Nusra Front initially, and then rebranded to become Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Now, really the key thing which most people have missed on this is really since 2017, they have gone local. It's known as going global. And that is that in terms of their global caliphate aspirations, there aren't any. So forget about that. That is why they are deemed to be apostates by those who are global caliphatists, IS. So, for example, in the last couple of weeks in Al-Naba, which is the IS weekly, they've absolutely stated that they are that HTS are apostates, and that they are not a group that is a jihadist group. So, take IS at his word. There's a difference between being a book-burning, monument-destroying medievalist group and what HTS is at the moment. However, having said that, the focus for them since 2017 has been on two things. Firstly, Russia as the new enemy, and secondly, at what they saw as Iran, part of the Shia Crescent, aiming to wipe out the Sunni people and for the glory of the Persian Empire. And there was a seeding within Syria of Iranians trying to sort of take over the state by stealth. So that's what the objective of HTS was, to get rid of both Russia and Iran. That objective has been obviously achieved. It's what comes after, and whether therefore they change their mission. That's the unknown there. So they are still a US designated terror group. There's been a lot of discussion actually in the last 7 years of whether that still holds, because of what I just said about this being a unit or a group which has gone local. And I think that it has. So if you look at how on two strands, firstly what we call the Takfiri scale, declaring someone apostate from Islam, or how an organization relates to society. On the one end of that, you've got a group like IS, which would exclude women and all that sort of stuff. On the other side of that scale, you've got an inclusive group, which has ethnic, religious, sectarian diversity. And at the moment, Jelani, both in what he said at the Aleppo Citadel and yesterday in his speech in Damascus, seems to be on the left of the scale in being inclusive, seeming to include the Druze, the Alawites, and the Christians. That is all a good sign for the future. The second way that we can look at this is how they, on the pan-Islam scale, how it relates to Islam. Are they global jihadists, or are they, as IS say about HTS, revolutionary Syrian nationalists? Now, as I've said, that mission as revolutionary Syrian nationalists, getting rid of both Russia and Iran, has been achieved. Does their mission statement now change in the future? So that's the first group, and they've been the spearhead really going through down through Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and on to Damascus. Not the only group. The second group really is the Syrian National Army. This is a coalition which historically has included the Free Syria Army. That included at one stage by 2012, the CIA said that there were up to 1,000 militias at the time, Katibas, operating within Syria. Now, there has been some consolidation of that. There are some sort of Muslim Brotherhood type groups within that, including Ahrar al-Sham, but that is really a sort of sponsored by Turkey and really working towards Turkish objectives. Now, that itself is an interesting one, because Turkey, of course, hates the Kurds and would like to see that the autonomous administrative region of northeast Syria probably dismantled. So one of the potential schisms is within the Syrian National Army, and the third group, which is, of course, the SDP, the Democratic Force, the Kurds, largely sponsored by the Americans, because that is the group which has been principally fighting IS in the last few years. Now, there still is an enduring American Operation Inherent Resolve, which has been this enduring operation for three reasons. It's there to degrade, disrupt, and destroy IS. And if you look at the figures, which I do, of the last 6 months, for example, there have been 153 attacks from January to June by IS in both Syria and Iraq. And the Americans, by, with, and through the SDP, have taken out 8 senior commanders and injured 32 others. So you have the SDF, Syria Democratic Force, sponsored by the Americans, and actually holding on to most of the resources in the East. They have 80 to 90% of the oil fields really under their command. And Jelani at the moment, and before he went into the offensive mode, has had a pragmatic relationship with the SDF. And so that also looks good for the future. And he will have to find some accommodation with them if he is to rule for all of Syria. The fourth group that we could potentially look at is what has happened in the Southern Ops room. So where the original revolution began was in the southern provinces around Dera. That's where it all kicked off back in 2012. And there you've had both Druze, Christians, and secular Syrians forming their own revolution, as it were, against Assad's rule, taking over, for example, Suwaidi. So those are the four main groupings that we've seen. Now, that obviously simplifies it when I said that there's been a sort of militarization of Syria in the last few years. Because one of the other things which has really occurred is that many, many years ago, Assad abandoned an all corners strategy, and he focused really on six principal cities in Syria, and of course the lines of communication between them. And that is why it was quite easy to fold in if once you'd captured the military vital ground, which in my estimation was actually Homs, because that severed the coastal heartlands of Latakia from Damascus, and that was militarily that absolutely makes sense.
Chip, that is a brilliant overview. Thank you so much for taking us through all of that. I suppose that the natural question, therefore, that follows on from that is, well, what happens with the Syrian civil war? Does it now come to an end with the fall of the Assad regime, or are we going to see infighting continue for many years to come?
Well, that's the $60,000 question. If Gilani can have an inclusive government for the future, and this will proceed by the speed of governance as well as the speed of diplomacy, then there is a chance that there may be a stable Syria in the future. Now, if you go back really to IS again, the propagandist for IS under Baghdadi was a chap called al-Adnani. And in terms of the West, he used to say, why we fight you and why we hate you. And there were three factors within that. Firstly, democracy. Secondly, pluralism. And thirdly, promotion of religions other than Islam. Now, what will Gilani do in those three factors? Will this be a democratic Syria for the future? Will it be a pluralistic society for the future? And will it be one that doesn't necessarily promote Islam over the other religions, but at least tolerates the other religions? And if all those things pertain, then there is some chance for the future, apart from the potential problem still with the SDF and the SNA, that is the Turkish-backed group, and their perennial problem with the Kurds. Now, one of the solutions which the AANES, the Autonomous Administration, Rojava basically have is potentially they see a model of decentralization very similar to the KRG in Iraq. That is the model of governance that they would seek. It may be that Gilani is going to be very pragmatic in that and not take a very centralized approach. But again, there are various models which you can go to for the future, including sort of a federal decentralization. So it depends on what model comes out for the future, but the real schism is probably going to be that between the Turkish-sponsored Syrian National Army and the American-sponsored, only because they're the buy with through in terms of the partnership against IS against the Syrian Democratic Forces, essentially the Kurds.
Let's talk about the impact on Iran. I mean, Iran, in many respects, has had a terrible year. Its proxy Hamas has been severely degraded in Gaza. Its proxy Hezbollah has been severely degraded in Lebanon. And now they've lost a key ally in the Assad regime. And as you say, Chip, that the Shia crescent has now been broken up because, of course, HTS is a Sunni Islamist group. So talk me through what this means for their regime in Tehran.
Well, you have to go back again to when I was doing this for real and worked for General Jim Mattis at CENTCOM. And then, of course, he became SecDef under Trump in the first administration. Now, when this all kicked off between 2010, 2012, when I was actively doing this with him, Mattis's line was always that losing Syria would be the greatest strategic setback for Iran since 1979 in the revolution. Now it's been achieved, and there's no doubt that this is the greatest strategic setback for Iran since then. It's been shown to be a paper tiger, both in terms of its support of the elements that it looked at. The Ring of Fire has been dismantled. The Levantine front has been shown to be a house of cards. Now, will this therefore lead to a blowback in Iran? Iran has always been quite fragile. And again, I don't think that their tentacles will be going out in the near future. There's always going to be much rhetoric from Iran. So the rhetoric in the last 6 weeks really has been that they're going to attack Israel again as a retaliation for the last attack Israel did on them. I think what the loss of Syria has done now, and of course all the S-300s, S-400s have been folded in, the air defense systems of the Russians and are no longer active, along with the bombing that the Israelis did last night. This gives absolute freedom of action for the Iranians, if they want to, at a time and place of their choosing, to go and take out any Iranian nuclear capability if there is any hint that they are going to go from an enriched position with their uranium to building a bomb. And certainly the American and Israeli intelligence is of the view that should they go towards that posture, that they would know very quickly and would be able to take action against it. So that's the first thing. So externally, it's absolutely in a mess, and its future externally has been shown to be this pack of cards. Internally, there are also centrifugal forces which do play against it. There are various provinces where they would have the same problems as Syria had. They could hold major cities if there were uprisings, but they couldn't hold all the rural areas. On that, they are certainly a lot weaker than they were previously, but unlike Syria, they still have very capable internal security forces, in the way that Syria really relied on a bunch of external militias, apart from Hezbollah, and a bunch of Shia militias from Afghanistan, for example, and a bunch of militias from Iraq. It's completely different in that sense in Iran, but it doesn't mean there are not weaknesses which could be exploited by oppositions in Iran. So it's been a terrible year for Iran. I don't see them recovering anytime soon.
Do you think, in the same way you said earlier, that what the fall of the Assad regime has shown us is that regimes that may superficially appear quite strong can crumble very quickly? Do you think the Ayatollahs could be at risk? Do you think the actual regime itself in Tehran could go the same way as the Assad regime?
Yeah, I do, but I don't think it's necessarily imminent at the moment. Now, I've always said, both in terms of what's happening in Russia, in Ukraine, that we look at this through the sort of Clausewitzian trinity, that if your army doesn't fight for you, if your people turn against you, or if there are elite defections within the government, then your house of cards is built on a very unstable foundation. The people are against the Ayatollahs, I think. Women life freedom is still a chant in Iran. They are still an oppressive regime, though, and they have the tools to do that, both in terms of their digital oppression and physical oppression. So in terms of imminency, I don't see that at the moment.
Let's come on to the impact on Russia, the other key ally of the Assad regime. A lot of people are saying this is a blow to Vladimir Putin's prestige, but is it more than that?
Well, I think it is. It depends if they can stitch up any agreement with a new government. If that's a Sunni government led by Gilani or the influence of Gilani, whose objective, as I said earlier, was to get rid of Russia as the new enemy, then I don't see them having their bases in the future. So the key things are their airbase in Latakia province, and of course their Tartus naval base. Now, the Tartus naval base enabled them to project power into the Mediterranean. Now, that well-known liar Lavrov has said all the ships have just gone on exercise at the moment. We don't know if that's true. I suspect it's more than that, and there will be some form of evacuation in the near future. The loss of the airbase, so the Mediterranean part from the naval perspective, is significant. The loss of the airbase is more difficult for them in terms of projecting power into Africa. That was really the main transit route for the sort of Africa core, which is taken over from Prigozhin's Wagner group in Africa. So it sort of disrupts that. Now that doesn't mean that is over. It just means the logistics of Russian operations are made far more difficult than they were by that base itself.
I mean, obviously, the Kremlin has come out and said that the Syrian rebels have guaranteed the security of Russian military bases and diplomatic institutions. But realistically, do you think that is just Kremlin propaganda? Do you think that position will be able to hold, or do you think the rebels will demand the return of the naval base at Tartus and the air bases?
Well, again, it depends on what sort of legitimacy you have from international agreements and who is the legitimate government who makes that decision. Because those agreements for both the air base and the naval base at Tartus were long-term agreements for 47 years. Now, can you rip up international agreements? Of course you can, if factors no longer in your favour. It would be absolutely wrong, I think, for the rebels to attack those bases if they're trying to show their own legitimacy for the future. But as I've said, because there were so many different militias and the militarization in Syria, then to me it seems that there will be score settling. This may not be centralized score settling, but just in terms of those who supported the Assad regime, and in particular the Mukhabarat, which was the security agencies, originally taught their tricks by the Stasi from East Germany. They are the torturers of Assad, and I would see some local scores being settled there. Everyone wants everyone to sort of live in peace and harmony, but for the future. But I do see some score settling there, and there's a number of other groups as well that Assad sponsored. A bunch of groups called the Shahiba, which also did terrible things on his behalf, which gave him plausible deniability because they weren't under the rubric of the Syrian armed forces. So I think that there will be local score settling in the same way that, for example, the French resistance settled some scores after the Second World War.
Is there anything you think Vladimir Putin may try to win favour with HTS and the new regime in Syria? I mean, for instance, obviously the Assad family have now fled to Russia and have been granted asylum there. Could he not sell them out, essentially, in return for some guarantees around Russia's presence in Syria at the bases?
I think that's an interesting quid pro quo if he were to do that. He's already been shown to be an ally who was, not someone who stood up for the regime after a certain length of time. That would be a very left field thing. I don't think that is a possibility, but you never know because the spin doctors in Moscow are very good at saying within a week, HTS have gone from a terrorist group to the opposition in the nomenclature of the Russians. So their ability to try and smooth waters is legendary, and Lavrov is the master at it.
And is there any knock-on effect here on the war in Ukraine and potentially peace talks in 2025? If Vladimir Putin has been seen, which he has over the past week, to have been weakened by what has unfolded in Syria, does that change the equation for potential peace talks?
I don't think it changes it very, very much. We've used the word weaken on Putin a number of times, most readily, of course, when Prigozhin was on his march to Moscow. He definitely has been weakened, but again, I don't think it's terminal in the same way that I don't think it's terminal for the Iranian regime at the moment. And I still think that Putin's objectives in Ukraine are the absolute total capitulation of the Ukrainian state, and that it becomes a vassal of Russia, and that he doesn't really seek honest negotiations. He would seek the surrender of Ukraine. I think it's interesting, of course, that President-elect Trump yesterday sort of said that he wanted an immediate ceasefire and negotiations. I don't think Russia would sign up to the first bit. And of course, if you're going to negotiate, you need to know what's on the table to begin with. And we know from Lavrov's talk with Tucker Carlson last week that we've got the same sort of conditions as we've always seen from the Russians. The new territorial realities have to be acknowledged by the Ukrainians. That is, they would have to cede all the 4 oblasts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk, along with Crimea, of course, that the Russian language should be, and the Russian Orthodox Church should be legitimized fully in Ukraine. And all these things are there, and that Ukraine should be neutral. All these things are really towards the arc of a surrender peace from a Ukrainian perspective. None of that is tenable at the moment.
But is the mood music not currently that actually it is Zelensky who is more prepared to have a conversation around peace talks than it is Putin? And if that is the case, is that not going to tire on Trump quite quickly, and he may lose patience with Putin, and potentially, therefore, if he thinks Putin isn't being serious, he will threaten in return a ramping up of US military aid to Ukraine?
And that is exactly the point that General Keith Kellogg made in the campaigning prior to the election, that what he saw Trump doing was saying to Ukraine and Zelensky, come to the table, or support will cease. But at the same time, saying to the Russians, come to the table or we'll support Ukraine with everything we've got. It's what's on the table, which is the important thing, not that the table is there.
Just to go back to the situation in Syria, how should the US and its Western allies approach HTS and the situation now? I mean, they are still technically a prescribed terror group, and the UK government is now reviewing that. But how should they view the situation and approach the situation, in your view?
Well, I think the first thing is they will need to look carefully at whether HTS is deprescribed. And that absolutely should be, as Biden said, based on not their words, which have been very good and very accommodating. You'd say at the moment that Jelani looks like an accommodationist, but on their actions. So it's the actions which are pretty key. What will continue, of course, is the campaign against IS, who are the global caliphate jihadists. The ones we haven't really talked about are the position of both Saudi Arabia and Qatar, because I think HTS were probably funded by Qatar as much as anything. And that's when you got another potential schism with the position of Saudi Arabia. And if Jelani and his merry men go more towards a sort of Muslim Brotherhood type of approach for the future, that is not something that Saudi Arabia would welcome. And what you really want from the Arab states is for they're the guys who really have the financial power to reconstruct Syria. It's in whose image are they to be reconstructed? Is it in the image of Qatar, which is more sympathetic towards the Muslim Brotherhood, or in the image of something which is slightly more enlightened? That will be another of these things to look for the future.
I mean, that's a really interesting point, because obviously the Arab world has sort of reluctantly reconciled to an extent with the Assad regime. They'd kicked Syria out of the Arab League, but then they sort of essentially readmitted them, I believe, last year. So how do you think that the wider Arab world will be looking at events in Syria?
Well, again, this is part of the problem, is that we've had a number of wars, either hot or cold, in the Middle East. You know, Shia versus Sunni, Sunni versus Sunni, Assad versus the rebels, everyone versus IS, Turks versus the Kurds, Iran versus Israel, Israel versus Hamas and Hezbollah, HTS versus Russia and Iran. Everyone would like all of those to be ameliorated. That takes both diplomatic patience and money to sustain a state for the future. So they are crucial, because I think one thing you can say from, again, what Trump has articulated in the last 2 days is that America are not really interested in getting involved apart from this enduring defeat of IS, because they are a threat potentially to the homeland.
And just finally, Chip, zooming out a bit, does this not underline the fact that actually 2024 has been a very good year in particular for Benjamin Netanyahu? Because this time last year, people were expecting him potentially to be removed from power very soon. Some people thought after October the 7th he wouldn't see out the year as Israeli Prime Minister. And yet if you look at what the Israeli military have accomplished this year, they have severely degraded Hamas, they have severely degraded the leadership of Hezbollah, and now Iran, its main enemy, is severely weakened. So it's been a very good year for Netanyahu, has it not?
Yeah, I think so. And I think you can see that the continuance of that really in the last couple of days, really. Firstly, the airstrikes that have taken place into Syria are the final act there in terms of degrading the missile and chemical warfare capability not wanting it to fall in the hands of a future regime which may go towards a more jihadist profile, but may not, but don't have the risk there. The second one is, of course, the occupation of the Golani Heights, even though that they say that is temporary. But I think it's also important to say that Netanyahu has reached out a hand of peace, as he called it, towards whatever the future government of Syria is. And this could be a reordering of the Middle East for good. So, yeah, I think you can make a case that this has been a good year for Netanyahu. The year's not over. 2025 could get worse. You never know.
Major General Chip Chapman, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.